So this is Church History 101. I just call it the early church, which is so this is 100 to 2. I'll be looking at 100 to 200 AD to, today and next week. As I started last time, I feel like we should start this time. This is basically what I've said. This is what we should be thinking when we approach church history. It says the story of the church cannot be reduced to any single denomination or creed. Rather, church history belongs to all those who profess that Jesus Christ is Lord, who believe in the gospel and who believe in the legacy of believers that has continued for 2,000 years. When we study church history, we are not coldly studying factual history. Rather, we are learning about the men and women who have gone before us, our spiritual brothers and sisters who have bravely kept the faith, many unto martyrdom. We will learn of the many victories of Christianity and, unfortunately, its many defeats. My hope is that as we discuss church history, we will not only see it as the story of the religious institution of the church, but as the story of God's redemptive action on earth. As the church is, after all, first and foremost the bride of Christ, and his chosen instrument to spread his gospel to every tribe and nation. In the last series back in March, we discussed the first century of the church, or the apostolic church. We call it the apostolic church because of the time when the disciples of Jesus are still alive. So we're going to briefly shoot through that. We start off that series with Pentecost, with the giving of the Holy Spirit to the people in Jerusalem. This marks the formal beginning of the church. Next, we see the martyrdom of Stephen in 34 AD. This marks the first time there is a Christian martyred for his faith. It also begins the first time that the Jews have taken action against Christians to do violence. Next, we have the conversion of Paul in 36 AD. This is when the apostle Paul encounters Christ on the road, going to Damascus to persecute the church there. He encounters the risen Lord. He is converted, and as a result, he goes on his missionary journeys, and he writes over half of the New Testament. Jumping forward, we have Paul's first, second, and third missionary journeys. This is where Paul, usually leaving from Antioch, travels into what was then Asia Minor and what is now Turkey, into Greece as well, and spreads the gospel there, teaches there, and supports the churches that are already there. We have the Council of... I jumped forward on one. I also have Peter's brings the gospel to Cornelius. This occurs anywhere from 36 to 40. This is significant because this is the first time that the gospel of Jesus Christ is being given to a non-Jew, to a Gentile, who then accepts the gospel. From this point on, Gentiles would come into the church. The Council of Jerusalem convened in 50 AD to answer the question, what do we do with Gentiles in the church? Because these were largely Jews who inherently did not like Gentiles. Many Pharisees were taught to consider Gentiles unclean. So you have to ask the question, how can Gentiles and Jews be in the same religion? The Pharisees wanted all Gentile converts to be forced to obey the law of Moses, to be circumcised, and to live like a Jew. Paul, on the other hand, had seen the Gentiles coming to faith, and he wanted to remove inhibition, any obstacle that would be in their path that would stop them from coming to the gospel. And so he did not want them to be forced to obey the law of Moses. The disciples and James, the leader of the church in Jerusalem, eventually made the decision that Gentiles would not be forced to obey the law of Moses, would not be forced to be circumcised. However, this did not stop Judaizers, or those who would go out and try to convince Gentiles to be circumcised. This did not stop them from doing so. And we will discuss a group called the Ebionites, who existed in the 2nd century, and they are connected to this group. Jumping forward, we have the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD. This is a massive fire that broke out in the city of Rome and destroyed a huge section of it. The Emperor Nero, who you all probably heard of at some point or another, the people didn't like him, and they suspected that he started the fire to allow himself to build his new palace. In order to bring suspicion off of himself, he decided to blame the Christians, who were already under suspect of the Roman people, largely because they were not like them. They already suspected them, and Nero saw a good scapegoat. Jumping forward, and so that would kick off Nero's persecution of the Christians from 64 to 68 AD. This is the first time the Roman Empire has officially persecuted and attacked the Christians. It is important to note that this persecution did not extend past the city of Rome. It did not affect the empire, mostly within the city of Rome. Estimates say about 1,000 Christians were killed. They were killed. Among them was likely the Apostle Paul and the disciple Peter. In this time, many Christians were fed to wild beasts, many were crucified, and many were lit on fire to illuminate garden parties, actually, particularly Nero's circus. This would end in 68 AD with Nero's death. The next big event is the first Jewish revolt in 66 to 70 AD. This is when the Jews revolted against the Roman rule that they were under, and as a result, this led to a 4-year-long war between the Jews and the Romans. The Jews trying to reassert independence over them from the Romans, and the Romans trying to quash this revolt. It ended with the Romans burning the temple in Jerusalem, destroying much of the city, massacring, estimates say, anywhere from 500,000 to 1 million Jews. And it officially ends with General Titus taking Jerusalem, but we discussed Masada. Masada lasted another 3 years after the fall of Jerusalem and ended with the Romans taking it and the Jews there committing mass suicide. This would be, after this point, there would be one more revolt, which we will talk about during this series. The next major event is Domitian becomes emperor in 81 to 96 AD. This is the next emperor who would try to persecute the Christians. Records say he was such a terrible emperor that the Senate decided that they decreed that all mention of him would be struck from history, so much so to the point that we know very little about him, actually. The next Clement of Rome I put in there because he represents a transitory figure between the Apostolic Church and the Age of the Church Fathers. Clement of Rome was a disciple of Peter who would become the Bishop of Rome. He is, prior to them, usually only the disciples or the followers of Jesus rule with authority. However, Clement writes a letter as the Bishop of Rome to Corinth to settle a dispute in that church. He writes with authority to weigh in on the situation. And so this represents the passing of the torch from the disciples to their disciples. Lastly, the age ends with the death of the Apostle John in Ephesus in 98 AD. It was very likely he was exiled to Patmos. This was after the writing of John. This was after the writing of Revelation. He was likely exiled by Domitian to Patmos, and eventually that exile would be released, and he would die in Ephesus. This is a very brief overview of the first century, just to give us an idea of what has gone on, and how does that lead into the second century. Jumping forward, a lot of this we're going to tackle in slides, but it's just to give you a chronological timeline of what the second century looked like. As we ended the first century, we'll begin the second with the death of John the Apostle. We will be discussing Ignatius. He is a church father who was executed in 107 AD. We will discuss him later. We'll also be discussing Irenaeus of Lyon, also a church father when he was born. We're going to stop for a moment. The Bar Kokhba revolt is considered the second Jewish revolt. This takes place from 132 to 135 AD. Once again, the Roman rule has pushed the Jewish people to revolt, and they revolt against the Romans, and they take up arms and try to fight. As the previous revolt is the same in the second revolt. Despite a series of successes in the first opening battles of the war, they went well for the Jews. After that, it just went bad. The Jews could not match the Romans' military and tactical ability, as well as their endless resources that they can simply pour into the situation. As I mentioned in the previous series, the Jews probably had it so in 160 BC, the Jews had been under the rule of 160 had been under the rule of the Greek Empire, the Seleucids. This sparked the Maccabean revolt. This was the time when this was sparked the Maccabean revolt, where the Jews did in fact go to war with the Seleucids, and they did win. So when we look at the first and second Jewish revolts of the Jews against the Romans, it's very likely they had in mind the Maccabean revolt. It's like, it's going to be the same thing. We're going to fight these invaders. We're going to push them off. We're going to win. What ended up happening is entirely different, because the Romans were not like the Greeks. The Greeks didn't have the power that the Romans had. Likewise, the Romans had a lot more to lose if they allowed this province to go. Because if they don't come down hard on the Jews, then who's to say the Gauls don't rebel next? Who's to say the Egyptians don't rebel? Because the Egyptians had only been under the Roman control for about roughly 130 years at this point. Who's to say they don't? And so to avoid mass rebellion, it was much easier for the Romans to crush the Jews than to allow massive revolt. And so the result of the Bar Kokhba revolt was once again the fall of Jerusalem. Once again, it was the slaughter of Jews, and the Romans added a new mandate. The Jews were henceforth exiled from Jerusalem. They were unable to enter their holy city. While this was happening, the effects of this revolt on the church are noticeable. It would be after this revolt that the church would be more deliberate that they were not Jews, and begin distancing themselves from Jewish practices that had carried over. This revolt may also have caused Marcion's theology to reject the Old Testament. So we'll be discussing, Marcion is right here. We'll be discussing him in this series. He is a 2nd century heretic who believed that the Old Testament was unimportant, that there were actually two distinct gods, the God of the Old Testament, the God of the New Testament, and the God of the Old Testament was evil, and that and he also rejected any idea that the Jews had a future in the God's redemptive plan. So he rejected the possibility of the divine plan for the Jews. Ultimately, this would further the divide between Christians and Jews. Jumping forward, we have Marcion begins his school or his religion. It's called Marcionism. It was a 2nd century heresy. We'll discuss that in a moment. Probably not this time, but next time. Clement of Alexandria is born. He is a church father who we'll chat about later. Polycarp's execution. Polycarp was a disciple of John. He was executed in 155 AD. His story of martyrdom is probably one of the most famous of the 2nd century. If you've ever read the Jesus Freaks Book of Martyrs, Book of Persecution. It was an older book from the 2000s. I might be dating myself, but that's just it. He was a old man, like 7. We don't have any time. Not that old. Not that. In that time, that was old. In this time, not so much. You're still in your prime. But at that time, he was about 80 years old, and he was given the opportunity to recant due to his old age. And he basically said, I have followed Jesus. I'm paraphrasing. I have followed my Lord Jesus for, I think at that point he said 80 years. I will not abandon him now. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about him later. Justin Martyr is martyred. It's almost as though it's in the name. The Antonine Plague is a plague that impacted the Roman Empire from 165 to 180. It killed roughly 10% of the Roman Empire. We will talk a little bit more about that later again. I put it in there because it is one of the first times that we see Christians actively living out the commands of Jesus, where he commands to take care for the sick and the poor. especially in the Roman world where the sick and the poor were not cared for, we see many Christians dying because they actively sought to live that out. And so we're going to talk about that later because it is a significant event. Tatian writes the Diatessaron in 170. Once again, we'll chat about that. Quick little note on that. The Diatessaron is the first time that the four synoptic gospels, which is Matthew, Mark, Luke, and James, are mentioned as it's an apologetic used to, or he was one of the apologists. So he is he writes the Diatessaron as a means of defending the faith, and in it he defends the use of the four synoptic gospels as being authoritative and scripture. And we will chat about that probably not this time, but in the next week. Theophilus of Antioch dies in 180 or 181. The year of the five emperors is an important point. The year of the five emperors begins with the assassination of the Emperor Commodus by his own personal guard, the Praetorians. They kill him in the winter of 192, and 193 begins a massive succession war between effectively five different emperors. And so you have Pertinax, who was crowned emperor in January and died in March. You have Didius Julianus, who was crowned emperor in March and died in June. And then you have Septimius Severus, who he would eventually be the one who would win out in the end. There was one other emperor who was his last name's Niger. It's like it's a Latin name. I'm gonna do him the service of the grave and not even try. But he was a rival general who tried to proclaim himself emperor. So effectively, he's called emperor, but never officially recognized as emperor. Septimius Severus engages him in battle in the battle of, I believe it's the Battle of Issus, and he wins out. And then he takes the fifth emperor, which is Clodius, and makes him junior emperor. So it's like, I'm high emperor, you get to be junior emperor. And then the Muratorian fragment we talk about I discussed the New Testament canon and how that came about. The Muratorian fragment is a fragment of parchment that we have that is the first time we are given a canon of the New Testament. This is dated back to roughly 170 to 200 AD. There. If hopefully this isn't overwhelming you guys. This is just to give, we will discuss all of this in detail. This is just to give a chronological account. The emperors, we discussed them very quickly. It's Trajan, who rules from 98 to 117. Hadrian is 117 to 138. Antonius Pius is 138 to 161. Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Varus co-rule for a period of time, and then Marcus Aurelius co-rules with Commodus for a period of time. So from 161 to 69, 161 to 180. Commodus is 177 to 192. Yes, Gladiator lied to you. And then we have the year of the five emperors with Septimius Severus ruling out in the end from 193 to 211. As we go through, I will mention something happened during the reign of, say, Trajan, something happened during the reign of Hadrian, Marcus Aurelius we'll discuss a little bit, and so on and so forth. Does that make sense? Kind of? Yeah? Does anybody have any questions so far? Or? Not quite yet?
I wish the front of my Bible was this.
What's that?
I wish the front of my Bible had this timeline.
Yeah?
It's much easier than all the colors. I've got all the colored lines.
Yeah.
I don't even...
It takes a minute to sort through it. Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, we'll just jump ahead a bit. Okay. So now we're gonna talk about the church's second century. So the second century of the church can be defined as a church working to understand itself. In the second century, we see a church that is expanded across the entire empire of the Romans and beyond, and is multilingual, multicultural, and lastly, it does not have the connection to Jerusalem and Israel that the first century church did. In the first century of the church, it relied on several foundational sources of identity and authority. By this, I mean something that binds them together fundamentally as Christians. Not just simply the gospel, not just simply the teachings of the disciples, but something that goes beyond that. So these foundations were those who, so there were those who had witnessed the time, or Jesus' time on earth. In the first century, you had many people who had physically seen Jesus, who had physically talked to him. Obviously, as the century progresses, that becomes less and less. The second is the apostles, as we discussed. By 98, John the Apostle passes away, and he is the last apostle, the last of the 12 who had been personal disciples of Jesus Christ. The church does not have them in the second century. The third is the brothers of Jesus, or who is James and Jude. We have so the book of James and the book of Jude are written by the half brothers of Jesus. And James would be the leader of the Jerusalem church until his death, and I believe 64. I believe that in around 60 AD, he would be killed by the Jewish religious elites. By the end, and lastly, we have the Jerusalem itself. As we said, Jerusalem was laid siege to and destroyed, or a large part of it was destroyed in the first Jewish revolt, including the temple, which many Christians would have still looked to in the first century as a place of identity, a place where this is what where we can still see as ours. That doesn't exist in the second century. By 135, we have the Bar Kokhba revolt finishing up, where Jerusalem is completely destroyed. As far as we know, every major building is razed to the ground. And so by the end of the first century, each of these foundations would be removed, and the church of the second century would have to work through who they are without them. This is what we can call the age of the church fathers, or the post-apostolic age. Whereas the first century can be defined by the birth and spread of the church, the second century was working through who are Christians, and what does the formation of practices and beliefs look like. For this reason, the church fathers, as we call them, were responsible with the tasks of welding together a vast and diverse church, and doing so during persecution from the Romans and heretical movements such as the Gnostics and the Ebionites. We will discuss both of those in detail later on. The Gnostics, just to briefly understand them, the Gnostics believed that Jesus gave to certain disciples secret teachings that those disciples then passed on to their disciples. And so they would go to a town and they say, you've been given the gospel. We have the secret teaching. You need to follow us in order so you can be saved. The Ebionites were Judaizers that after the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, the Ebionites popped up. They fundamentally denied that Jesus was the Son of God. They denied that he was divine. They denied that he was the God of the Old Testament. They believed that the value of living in poverty, and they also believed that in order to be saved, you must become Jewish. And so they would remain a small sect of heretical Christians that would exist after in the second century and third century. Give me 1 second. With the end of the first century, the church saw the last apostle pass away, and with him died the last witness of the Lord's ministry. Although the apostles were gone, the disciples of the apostles continued the work of their teachers. This would become very important later when the issue of apostolic succession would come up. Apostolic succession would be a result of the Gnosticism. So the church's response to the Gnostics saying, we have secret teaching, the real teachings of Jesus, the leaders of the church would say, well, I was taught by Peter. I was taught by John. I was taught by this disciple, or my teacher was taught by this disciple. And they would create the branch of apostolic succession of saying, we have a continuous line from Jesus through the apostles to the present day of the teachings that we were given. Today, this still continues with the Roman Catholic and the Eastern Orthodox Church. Many of them would say that Protestants do not have the right to be a church because we do not believe in apostolic succession. We can discuss later why we don't believe in that, or why we can challenge that, but that would be a claim they might make. During the second century, the church would also be forced to, largely due to heresy, formally work through their theology concerning God, Christ, the Trinity, the Bible, and more. While we do not have formal councils we see in the 4th century, we see in the 2nd century the thinkers of the church beginning to wrestle with these questions. They would also encounter another problem, developing the language necessary to explain their theology. Christian theology was almost entirely new to the world, and the language did not exist to explain things like the Trinity, like the hypostatic union. Both are unique to Christianity with little or limited reference to Judaism. The Jews did not have a concept of the Trinity. They did not have a concept of a man who was fully man and fully God. They didn't have these things. And so as the church would progress, they would have to develop the language necessary to actually explain what they're talking about. And the issue is, and we'll discuss this time, was whether or not the church you were talking to is Greek or if they're Latin. Because we would find out that each would be talking about much the same thing, but in different concepts. And so the language barrier between these two churches would pose an issue. So this is in Latin, but it was one of the better maps that I could find. The main reason I want to show you this is it is dated to 117 AD. This map shows the Roman Empire at the height of its power. So we see it extends all the way down to down the Nile in Egypt, all the way over to this is the Euphrates and the Tigris River. So this would be the modern Middle East, and it extends all the way up to almost to Scotland there, actually. And it would all North Africa, Spain, France, bits of all of Italy, Switzerland, all of Greece, Turkey. This is the Roman Empire at the height of its power. This is when they are the largest. And so this is what the 2nd century would have understood to be the Roman Empire.